Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. So, in our last class we learnt about koto, how to use koto with verbs, with adjectives and with nouns. With that, last week we also did a very sweet story in Japanese, Ahiru no ko, in fact Minikui Ahiru no ko, and how the Ahiru changes into a swan. So, through that story we also learnt new forms and how it can help us improve our spoken skills in Japanese. I also told you last time that we are going to do conditionals in this class. So, well, let us see which conditional we have here today for you. Before that, I want you to listen to this kaiwa and see how much you understand without my explanation. So, well, let us see.
すみません。切符売り場はどこですか？
あそこです。
ありがとう。すみませんけど、ちょっと機械の使い方がわからないから教えていただけませんか？
どうぞ。ここにお金を入れて、このボタンを押すと切符が出てきます。
どうもありがとう。
いいですよ。
So, well, you just heard the kaiwa. It's a very simple kaiwa at the station. So, Meera is asking the eki in, which is the person at the counter at the desk, information. How do I get this kippu? I don't know how to use the machine. So, how do I buy a ticket from the vending machine? So, he explains and I will do the explanation now. First, Meera is asking this hito, this tanin, sumimasen, kippu uriba wa doko desu ka? Kippu is ticket and uriba is the marketplace. But over here for kippu uriba, it will refer to a vending machine. Where is the vending machine placed? Where is it so that I can go and buy a ticket for myself? Doko, you know, means where, it is a question word for where. So, hito says, this person says, tanin says, asoko desu, and tanin could be anybody, any person, person 1, person 2, person 3, tanin 1, tanin 2, tanin 3, and Meera just says arigato and she moves away and she goes to the kippu uriba and over there, soko de. Now, what happens over there? She goes and she tries to sort of put a coin inside and try to get the kippu, but everything is in Japanese and she cannot understand. So, well, she immediately goes to the eki in. Eki means station and in means an employee of the station. Like you have done ten in, depato in, kaisha in. So, in a similar manner, eki in, employee of that company or that place. So, she goes there and she says, sumimasen, chotto kikai no tsukai kata ga wakaranai kara oshiete itadakemasen ka? Now, this is very polite. So, sumimasen because she is asking for a favor, chotto, I am unable to understand how to use the machine, kikai is machine and tsukai kata, way of using the machine ga wakaranai kara because I do not understand, oshiete itadakemasen ka, and the spelling over here is a little incorrect. It is just oshiete because it is a group 2 verb, oshieru. So, oshiete itadakemasen ka. Now, you have done ageru and morau. So, what is the polite for ageru and polite for morau? Morau is itadaku. So, please will you tell and I will receive this favor from you, that is the meaning. So, eki in says, dozo koko ni okane o irete, kono botan o osu to kippu ga dete kimasu. So, he says, come over here please, dozo, koko ni okane o irete, over here please put the coin I, re, ru, group 2 again. So, you have a single T. So, I, re, te, kono botan o, botan is button, o, osu, to, o, su is to press. If you press this button, then in that case kippu ga dete kimasu. Kippu is going to come out. Now, if you remember, we did te kimasu last time, isn't it? And te iku in our last lesson in ahiru no ko. So, when somebody goes away from the speaker, then it is te iku, te iku. So, in a continuous state, continued state of change, iku. In a similar manner, when someone or something comes close to the speaker from somewhere, then it is te kuru. So, kippu ga dete, verb in te form, plus kimasu. So, if you have this machine over here, put your money here and immediately you will have the kippu coming out from here. So, it comes out, that is the meaning. Now, you have done one phrase also with this, te ittekimasu. With this one, if you remember, itte kimasu, I will go and come, and then itte irashai, and irashai, if you remember, is also polite for iku. So, itte irashai, I will go and come back. So, a change of state, continuous change of state like this. So, well, we are going to do all this in detail once again over here. I hope you could follow some of it, try to use it in a similar situation. Now, you have kippu over here, uri, ba. Now, kippu is a common kanji that you should know. This is kiru, which is to cut, and kippu is like this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, then 1, 2, and like this kippu. So, you do not have to write the kanji, you can just remember and recognize. Then there is uriba, urimasu you have done. Remember doing urimasu, this is small and this is big. If you can see it over here, clearly it is given, and then 2 legs over here, uri and then ba. Ba is place. It looks very, very complicated. I am drawing with the pen here in this manner, so it becomes a little unstable and not proportionate, but well, you can make it again over here like this, nichi, and then you have this and like uchi over here. So, ba meaning place, tokoro. So, uri ba, place where it is sold. Then kikai of course is there, but kikai you do not do because it is very, very difficult and it is not even in your course. Tsukai kata we did last time like this, and then tsukai and kata like this, tsukai kata, okane, kippu and deru. You have 2 yamas over here, which is deru. So, do the kanjis, recognize them. Osu is another kanji which you can do. It is a simple kanji like this and simple cut it. So, osu, to press. So, we are going to do these 3 conditionals, to, tara and ba. Now, what are conditionals? Well, you can understand from the word itself that in such sentences there is always a condition attached. Whatever is being said or whatever happens, one part of the sentence is dependent on the other. That is, there is a cause and there is an effect. So, something will happen first and then there will be something else. Now, see over here, for example, if we have two sentences, say sentence 1 and sentence 2, as I have written over here. So, if there is a condition, then what is going to happen? The first part of the sentence, or the first sentence you could say, controls sentence 2. How does it control? There is a cause over here for this effect. Whatever happens over here is totally dependent on S1, which is the sentence 1, first part of the sentence. This is the cause, this is the reason why something is happening over here in sentence 2. We can also say that sentence 1 now decides what happens over here in sentence 2. As sentence 1 is the cause over here for the result, then sentence 1 decides the resultant, the final outcome of sentence 2. Now, once we say this, then we can also say that sentence 2 is completely dependent on sentence 1, meaning that if sentence 1 does not happen, say whatever is happening over here in the first part of the sentence does not happen, then this part will not take place at all. For example, if I say that if I do not come to class, there is going to be no class, because I am the one who is teaching over here, and if I do not come, then well, there is going to be no Japanese class at all. So, the Japanese class is totally dependent on my coming, is not it? Or I could say that it is also dependent on the students coming. I can come over here, but if the students do not come, then we again cannot have a Japanese class. So, this part is totally dependent on this one, that is S2 is dependent on S1. Now, we can also say that the resultant or the effect is completely dependent on S1 and is non-controllable. In certain situations, there are certain things which happen naturally, are a natural outcome of something which happens regularly over a period of time. So, now we can also say that at a certain period, at a certain given time, something is going to happen and the outcome or the resultant or the effect is going to be a natural thing. It has to happen. It can only happen. If this situation is there, then this will happen. So, this is used for generally natural occurrences, and then a conditional is used. So, the conditional that we are going to do today is somewhat like that. So, let us see what it is. So, now I will just tell you once again, I just explained it to you there as well. So, sentence 1, sentence 2, whatever happens here, the conditional that we are going to do today, for that, this is a natural outcome. This is how it is going to happen all the time. If this situation is there, then only this outcome can be there, nothing else. There can be no other thing. The conditional that we are going to do, we use it very often in our speech and conversation. So, try to remember the do's and don'ts and how it is to be used. I have tried to explain it in the simplest manner I could. Now, you also have to remember with these conditional words that they are used depending on the situation and condition. So, we are going to do to over here today, and you have done to, particle to, earlier in different ways. One of them is as and. For example, Mira to, Rao to, Neha wa Tokyo Daigaku no gakusei desu. So, A plus B plus C. So, A to, B to, C wa. We are talking about these three. So, particle wa. A to B to C wa Tokyo Daigaku no gakusei desu. Incidentally, Tokyo Daigaku is Todai also, referred to as Todai. So, anybody says Todai, remember that it is Tokyo Daigaku. So, one way is and. Keiki to chocolate to okashi ga suki desu. It could be anyone, watashi or anyone. Watashi wa keiki to chocolate to okashi ga suki desu. So, used as and. Now, you have also used it as to omoimasu as a quotation marker. Omoimasu is I think, and to put whatever comes over here before omoimasu, to put it in quotes, we use to. For example, watashi wa rainen no kokusai kaigi ni ikanai. This is how it is. To omoimasu. I do not think I am going for the international conference next year. So, we have done this to omoimasu as well. You can frame as many sentences as you want. I have given you enough examples earlier. Now, the other to that we have done is with. And how have we done that? Watashi wa anata to issho ni ryoko ni ikitai. I want to go with you, together with you. Anata to issho ni. Then watashi wa. Ha is written in the script. So, it is ha, which is wa, used as particle wa. In Roman we write wa. So, this is just a misprint. Watashi wa Tanaka-san to issho ni ikimasen. So, somebody is saying XYZ, maybe Mira-san, that I do not want to go with Tanaka-san. So, we have done this to also. Now, today we will use it as if or when to show condition. So, let us see how it is used from some example sentences. Now, particle to over here. If A occurs, then B will occur too. So, it is a natural resultant, natural occurrence that if this happens, this is also going to happen. Haru ni naru to sakura ga sakimasu. Sakura is the pink flower which is viewed during Hanami time, the flower viewing festival of Japan, very, very famous in the month of April, May. So, haru, haru is spring. Spring ni, ni is for time, because spring is a specific time. So, haru ni naru to, when it is haru, when it is spring, then what is going to happen? Sakura is going to bloom. Sakura ga sakimasu. So, sakura will not sakimasu in aki, during aki or during fuyu. When is it going to happen? When it is atatakai, when it is haru. So, only under this circumstance is sakura going to sakimasu. So, particle to, it is a natural occurrence, it will happen, you cannot stop it. Now, another thing which we all say, undo o shinai to futorimasu. Well, if you just keep eating and sitting at home and not doing anything, no exercise, what is going to happen? You are going to become fat or maybe even sick. So, shinai to, what is the natural outcome? Most of the time, maybe it does not happen, but most of the time. This has not happened as yet. We are just speculating that if this happens, then this is the outcome. In this case, it will always happen like that. In this case, most of the time it will, maybe sometime it may not. Otona da to waribiki ga arimasen. So, if you are an adult, then you are not getting any, waribiki is discount. So, you are not getting any discount. Gakusei da to waribiki ga arimasu. If you are a student, then you will get a discount. Now, aki ni naru to ki ga akaku narimasu. It turns red. So, even this is a natural thing that during Aki, during autumn, every time the leaves become red or the ki tree turns red, which is it looks red. Now, what can you see from the sentences? As the action is for the future, that is action has not taken place as yet, then you will see that whatever comes before to will always be in present tense. Aki ni naru to, when it is Aki, when it is autumn. So, the action has not taken place. So, then in that case whatever comes before to is always in present tense. Then what follows to can be in present or can be in past tense also. Now, this is a little confusing. How do we do that? Over here it is very clear, haru ni naru to sakura ga sakimasu. So, present, that okay, it is going to bloom, but over here I am also saying it is past tense. So, how does that happen? Now, you can look at these sentences. We often use this. I am sure some point you have used it in either English or in your mother tongue. Kodomo no toki watashi wa yoku kaze o hikimashita. Simple sentence that I would often catch a cold when I was a child, or as a child I would many times, lot of times catch a cold. Kaze is cold and kaze is otherwise wind also. Because it is with hikimasu, we understand that it is cold. Now, kodomo no toki fuyu ni yoku kaze o hikimashita. So, this is a normal statement that as a child I would many times catch a cold. No specific time is mentioned, just as a child. Yoku kaze o hikimashita. Over here he says as a child, fuyu ni yoku kaze o hikimashita, that is during winter. So, winter time was more. The moment it would be winter, I would immediately get a cold. I would maybe get cold earlier as well, but winter time definitely yoku kaze o hikimashita. Most of the time or lots of times, many times I would have kaze. I would be running to the doctor, or my parents would be worried, or if some of you have children, well, you will be running around. Now, look at this one, kodomo no toki fuyu ni naru to, once it would be fuyu, kaze o hikimashita, I would get a cold. So, this is how you will use it in past tense also. Maybe you may not be able to use it that easily at the moment, but well, you can keep it somewhere at the back of your mind. Anytime someone says that in front of you, well, you will understand what it means. Now, if some change is to be shown in the second part of the sentence, that is, so far we have just said that if such a situation is there, then this is the resultant. Now, if you want to show the resultant, or maybe whatever was there in the first sentence, it has changed to something else, then you will have to use an adjective or a na adjective or a noun. So, let us see how that is done. You have already learnt that, it is just that it is coming as a conditional also over here. So, well, let us see. To show change in sentence 2 with I adjective, na adjective or noun, for I adjective we use kunaru, and with na adjective we use ni naru. We have done it as naru earlier. So, now let us see. Fuyu ni naru to, when it becomes cold or when it is winter, then what happens? Samuku narimasu. It becomes cold. This is a natural outcome, natural thing, that the moment it is winter time, then it becomes cold. The weather changes and it is cold. Now, over here, if you look at this one, fuyu ni naru to yuki ga furimasu. This is a statement that what happens during winter in cold places, the moment it is winter, then yuki or snow starts falling. So, that is a natural outcome. Now, hito no mae ni hanasu to what happens? When you talk in front of a lot of people, unknown people, what generally happens with most of us? There are a lot of people where this does not affect them at all, but there are a lot of people who get affected by this. The first time or the second time, once you get used to it, then you are all right. So, hito no mae ni hanasu to, as is given over here, what happens generally? You feel a little embarrassed, you are a little shy, you are hesitant, so you are all red in the face and you do not know what to do, isn't it? So, hoppe ga, that is your cheeks, ga akaku or face ga akaku narimasu. Akai is the word over here, akai, and remove the I and put ku and naru, akaku naru, it becomes red. So, there is a change when you talk in front of people, unknown people, then this is what happens sometimes. Then aki ni naru to, when it is aki, ki ga akaku narimasu. So, over here you can see in Japan, in cold places generally, when it is autumn, then the weather changes and the trees become all shades of red and brown and it looks very pretty. And sometimes the trees even turn yellow, that is the leaves turn yellow. And this is a picture of Tokyo University, and you have these beautiful trees and the leaves during winter they all turn yellow. So, and you can also see some on the road. So, aki ni naru to ki ga akaku narimasu. So, by this you show change. Then if you are using na adjective or noun, then obviously ni will come. We have done this earlier with narimasu. So, watashi wa okasan to hanasu to, okasan to over here with, and okasan to hanasu to over here is when. So, when I talk with or to my okasan, genki ni narimasu, I feel very nice, I get all the energy from there. Then yoru ni naru to, once it is night time, machi wa shizuka ni narimasu, shizuka ni narimasu. So, it becomes very quiet. Or yoru ni naru to machi wa nigiyaka ni narimasu, it becomes very lively. Or you can say yoru ni naru to shitamachi, shitamachi is the downtown area where you especially have your offices, then wa shizuka ni narimasu, it becomes very, very quiet. So, ni naru is what is important with na adjectives and nouns. Over here also genki is a na adjective. The kanji for genki is simple, like this over here, and then this and a cross. So, genki. Machi over here is like this, a simple kanji, okasan watashi is already there, hanasu you know. Then Mira-san wa ii sensei ni narimasu or narimashita. So, narimashita is that she is already a teacher and a good teacher at that, and then narimasu is for the future. So, shorai Mira-san wa ii sensei ni narimasu. So, I am looking at her, observing her, and I can see in the future she is going to become a very good teacher. Ni naru. Now, to can also be used to give directions. How? Massugu iku to hidari ni yubinkyoku ga arimasu. We have seen that with the taxi driver, if you remember, when you give instructions to the taxi driver, massugu itte kudasai or massugu 100 meter iku to eki ga arimasu. In that manner you can use it to give directions. Then this is a little different from giving directions. Kosoku doru ni yuki ga aru to abunai desu yo. So this is a statement where a general statement, not by anybody specially, just a general statement that kosoku doro means highway. Ni, if you have yuki, then it is very, very abunai. Abunai is dangerous. Then jidosha no taya ga furui to, if your kuruma tires are old, then it is very dangerous. The car could break down or you could land with a flat tire any time. So you have to be careful. So furui to with adjectives. Furui to abunai desu yo. Then sensei ni kiku to sugu wakaru. So maybe two students are talking, can you tell me this, I don't know this one, what are we supposed to do with this, how do I make a sentence with this? Then somebody says sensei ni kiku to, if you ask sensei, then sugu wakaru, immediately you will know. So this is how you will use to as a conditional. So sentence 1 is telling you about the effect here. If this is happening, then this is happening. So now what can you observe from the sentences that we did just now? Well, when do we use to? One, a natural consequence or outcome of something, of an action or an activity. Naturally something happens or naturally something is incorrect, then or correct for that matter. It could be operating a machine or electrical appliances, you can use to. For example, botan o osu to heya ga akaruku narimasu. So if you press the button, then it becomes nice and bright. If you press the button, then the machine starts moving. So for electrical appliances you can use, or when giving directions, as I just told you. So these are the three places you can use particle to. Now there are certain rules, and those you have to keep in mind when using to, where to use to and where not to use to. So first we will do where not to use to, which is haru ni naru to picnic e ikimashou. This is a statement, all right, but this is a suggestion. So for suggestions we cannot use to. Why? Because what is the natural outcome? That something else will happen. Picnic you can go anytime. So haru ni naru to picnic e ikimashou? No, haru ni picnic e ikimashou. Then gakko ga hayaku owaru to uchi ni kite kudasai. So this is a request. Again, you cannot use it for request, that please gakko ga hayaku owaru to, if your gakko finishes very early, in that case what is the outcome, that you come home? No, you cannot. This is an incorrect sentence. Grammatically also it is incorrect. Then gakko ga hayaku owaru to uchi ni kimasen ka, you are asking somebody, inviting somebody over. For invitations, for request, for suggestion, you cannot use to as a conditional. This is not a condition, that gakko ga hayaku owaru to uchi ni kimasen ka. No, there is another conditional which you can use over here, not to. To will be incorrect. Now gakko ga hayaku owaru to dobutsu e ne ikitai. Again your desire with to. With to we can show natural outcome. If you just remember that much, then it will be easy for you to use particle to as a conditional. That generally the outcome is natural. Only this can happen and nothing else. Only this effect is going to be there, nothing else. So in that manner use particle to as a conditional. Now see, your desire you saw, ikitai, cannot use it. Invitation, masen ka, cannot use it. Suggestion, masho, ikimasho, cannot use it. Request, kudasai, cannot use it. Order, ikinasai, cannot use it. Gakko ga hayaku owaru to ikinasai. Gakko ga hayaku owaru to uchi e kite kudasai. Gakko ga hayaku owaru to ikimashou, picnic e ikimashou. Gakko ga hayaku owaru to uchi ni kimasen ka? Gakko ga hayaku owaru to dokoka e ikitai. All these will not be used. That is, in this situation you will not use particle to. There is another conditional which we will do later that you can use. Now order is new over here, so iki nasai. So iku, yomu, nomu, taberu, group 2. These are group 1. What are we going to do? Tabe, mas, remove the mas form and put nasai. So tabe mas, yomi mas, nomi mas, all of it, iki mas, remove the mas and put nasai. Iki nasai, yomi nasai, tabe nasai and nomi nasai. It is an order coming from top to bottom, that is from people senior to you. It can be used, but you cannot use on the other hand with your seniors. Please remember that with nasai form. So now there is a sentence in the kaiwa, kikai no tsukai kata. What does it mean? Well, kata you know is method or way. It is a suffix, meaning it comes after the verb. Way or method, it is given over here. So way of doing a certain action. So what do? Aruki kata, hanashi kata, warai kata and tabe kata. So mas is to be removed and kata is to be put. That is all that needs to be done and meaning changes. Aruki kata is way of walking, way of talking, way of laughing and way of eating. So kanojo no hanashikata wa totemo teinei desu. Kanojo no kotoba no tsukaikata wa totemo jouzu desu. So kanojo no kotoba no tsukaikata wa totemo jouzu desu. So she is very good with her words. The way she uses her words, it is exceptionally good. She is very jouzu at it. So this is how you will use kata. I have done it earlier, I am just doing it again so that it stays with you. Use it for anything you want during conversation. The forms that I give are generally for conversation, easy to use, easy to remember when you are doing conversation. So from sentences you can practice now. You can look at this. So they are all laughing in a very funny manner. So futari no warai kata wa okashi desho. So rising intonation. It is very, very strange. They are laughing maybe loudly or maybe rolling on the floor. So it is very okashi. Then Mariko-san no hanashikata wa teinei desu. It is very, very polite and respectful. Hanashi kata, the way she talks, the way she expresses herself, wa teinei desu. Then kare no tabekata wa chotto ne. So the way he is eating is not very nice probably. So somebody comments, kare no tabekata wa ne chotto ne. Chotto, hen is the word, but well, you do not say that generally. Nobody comments like this, but well, just to tell you how kata is used, I am just giving you these sentences. Kanojo no aruki kata wa totemo suteki desu. It is very, very stylish. 彼女の漢字の書き方はとっても上手です。So the way she writes kanji is very good. So you can use kata like this in your sentences. So there is a small kaiwa here. Listen to the kaiwa, and there are a few things which I will tell you after the kaiwa. So
すみません。この機械の使い方を教えてくれませんか？
ごめんなさい。これの使い方はラオさんしかわからないので、ラオさんに聞いてみてください。
ラオさんはどこですか？
隣の部屋だと思います。
あら、すみませんけど、ラオさんはそこにいません。
ああ、そう。事務室にいるかもしれない。
ありがとう。行ってみます。
So A さんと B さんの会話で、すみません、この機械の使い方教えてくれませんか？ Won't you please tell me how to use this machine over here? ごめんなさい、これの使い方はラオさんしかわからないので、ラオさんに聞いてね、or 聞いてください。ラオさんしか、only ラオさん knows. So please ask him. Or if he says 聞いてね、then it is a very very informal conversation, or maybe somebody older to A-san is talking to him. ラオさんはどこですか？隣の部屋です。meaning 隣の部屋にいます。すみませんけど、ラオさんはそこにいません。So A-san comes back after looking in the next room and he says, すみませんけど、I'm extremely sorry, but ラオさんはそこにいません。あ、そう。じゃあ、事務室にいるかもしれない。Maybe he is in the 事務室。ありがとう。行ってみます。So I will just go check and see. So this is a simple kaiwa. I think most of it is clear. Shika and kamoshiremasen we will do. So この漢字の読み方を教えてくれませんか？ Will you please tell me? Very very humbly he is saying. So kanji is like this. Uru we did just now, remember? We did uru. So it comes in yomu also. Yomi kata. Kata is like this. Now there is another kanji, oshieru, 1, 2, 3, like this, kodomo, and then what do you do? Like this, oshieru, which means to teach. Then, sumimasen, kono kanji no yomikata mo wakarimasen. I also do not know the yomikata of this kanji. So kanji very very simple, like this. Make a kuchi, make these two lines, cut it over here, and then this, and ji is like this, kanji. Kan is this and ji, Chinese characters. Sumimasen, so he is saying sumimasen for I am sorry, I am unable to read this one as well. Tanaka-san no hanashikata wa amari wakaranai. I am unable to understand his hanashi kata, the way he talks. Maybe he talks in an accent and he is unable to understand, the gentleman who is saying this. Then Tanaka-san no hanashikata wa yoku wakaranai. So over here I am unable to even get what he is trying to say. Amari wakaranai is, well, towards the negative, yoku wakaranai, meaning broadly both are same, using different adverbs amari and yoku, and the degree changes. Hanashikata wa amari wakaranai, softening this sentence a little, I am unable to understand. Yoku wakaranai, direct, that I do not understand what he is saying. So I have this exercise for you. There are a lot of pictures. Look at the pictures and use hoshi and tai form and make sentences. And also you have naru or ni naru. Try to match column A with column B. There is lots more to talk about and tell you. Here there is shika, there is kamoshirenai, because we have very little time left now. So I will take this to the next class. In the next class also we are going to do conditionals, two other conditionals which are very very important, tara and ba. One of them you have done earlier, You have no idea that you have done, but you have done it, you have covered it, you use it in your sentences, and the remaining one we will do in our next class. There is lot of kanji also to be done. So, well, come prepared, do this to form and come prepared for your next class. Till then, arigatou gozaimashita. Mata aimashou.